Hello, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my very good old friend and absolutely amazing, wonderful cellist and musician, David Waterman. This is now a new Beethoven series, so thank you very much for joining us. And David, as you have guessed, the topic is all about Beethoven, and this is at least what we can do. Such a important year for Beethoven. 250, and not a very lucky year, I guess, to celebrate his anniversary.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Julia. It's such a pleasure to talk to you and see you again. And yes, I suppose you're right. It is unlucky. Maybe it makes us reflect on Beethoven's isolation and his deafness, which was, he was such a warm and gregarious man, and the deafness not only was, obviously a huge problem in terms of being a musician, but in terms of being a social being. He was forced into isolation. So maybe we get some idea of what it was like for him, except that he was doing it, suffering it alone, instead of sharing it with the internet as we are.
Yeah, that is extraordinary. I must say, I've never thought about it, and you are absolutely right. This sort of isolation, of course, that you have when you can't hear.
He writes about it, actually. He talks about it. It partly came from an embarrassment because he felt that his career as a musician would be hampered if people realized he was deaf. So he deliberately tried to hide it for a long time, yes. Especially at the beginning. And but partly, just the sheer frustration of not being able to hear what people were saying to him, even when it was known that he was deaf. And then the conversation, the notebooks started, the conversation books. But it's very different, writing things down.
Of course, and it must be, I guess, difficult, but also I think you kind of blame yourself. There is a sort of that guilt and I think anger, right, within you. I think that's what a lot sits in the music. That subconscious kind of dissatisfaction with yourself. At least that's what I'm thinking.
I don't know if I hear that. I hear sometimes rage and anger sometimes, but on the other hand, I think that's a small part of it. There's such a range of emotions. There's everything, isn't there? There's
exactly
such humor, there's such lightheartedness, there's such joy. He's one of the composers who sounds joyful and utterly untrammeled joy, almost as much as anybody. And there's lovingness, there's moral seriousness, there's energy, serenity, everything really. I just sort of picked this up because you quite often hear Beethoven characterized as fist-shaking, angry composer because of one or two works, because of maybe the Fifth Symphony or parts of the Fifth Symphony, and then some obvious works. But I think there's so much. I think that's not a major part of what he does. It's only looking at the quartets.
Yeah.
You could say almost every other one is a very gentle and warm and funny piece. 59.2 is extremely tense and intense and fist-shaking, but 59.1 is pastoral. It's like the pastoral symphony, same key, and it's just expansive and largely speaking, extremely good-natured, extremely playful. So it's all there, and what there is in all of them is complete integrity and self-confidence and self-assuredness. So that's what I hear.
Absolutely. I think the kind of the range, as you touched, it's so wide. It really is. Just like a barometer. The arrow is here, and then the next.
Yes.
It's beautiful, and I think that's what makes it very hard to play. At least I think one of the most difficult things for me is this rapid dynamic changes. You know, how do you adapt for that? And I'm really wondering if we can go a little bit into sort of the technicality of this. You
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
I think this would be very interesting for me to explore.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Also, I mean, I think hard to play in the late period. The rapid and extreme changes of mood are hard to capture as a player, because as a player one is so identified with a particular mood, and
Sure.
it comes through you when you feel the mood, and then suddenly to change your face and become a completely different character, completely different mood is emotionally challenging. I think one has to get used to doing that, and that's particularly a feature of the later works, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is, for me, I mean, Beethoven is an extremely, you know, hard composer to interpret well, but I think also technically and in your brain, exactly what you say, it's so hard to switch when it's not your music. You almost have to sort of be in his shoes, and I'm really wondering. I know it's a very maybe personal, maybe too personal question, but how do you prepare for this? Do you have images that you try to change in your head, or does it just come naturally because you practice and essentially you become that kind of piece of music?
Yes, I think this is a big question. I mean, I think in the end, you do become that piece of music, and all the myriad of details of your practicing, both musical details and instrumental details, um, hopefully are so embedded and mastered in a way that that in performance you are just embodying the piece. The piece is living through the prism of you, the way you see it, which hopefully is different, slightly different from the way anyone else sees it. But it's a relationship between you and the score, and which creates a unique moment. It's a relationship between you on that particular evening
Yes.
and the score, which might be different from the following week. Um, but I think more and more when I prepare any piece, really, it's not specific to Beethoven at all, but I do want to know how it's built. I want to know, you know, I want to follow the motifs and the melodies and see how they develop and see how they interact, and do tend to think of them as characters in a novel in which they grow and interact and they have a story, and I want to know what story the music is telling. And part of that story is the not only the melody and the motif, but the harmonic structure in almost any sonata form music,
Sure.
or tonal music rather, and understanding the harmonic design of
Sure.
of the work and of each movement, because I'm not so much talking about each change of chord on a very, very local level, but more the major changes of key,
Sure.
because they so much paint a picture of the mood, the sort of the underlying feeling. I mean, a modulation
Yes.
to from a major to a minor key, from a minor to a major, or certain key relationships have a certain feeling. I mean, added to all the other aspects, rhythmic and motivic and so on. But that's very important. So I really feel I want to understand that very clearly. And then I suppose, I mean, the phrase shapes, how long each phrase is, where the music breathes, the main point in every phrase. I mean, where the point of greatest tension is, where the point of relaxation is, because there's always in this music, in all music, I think, intensification and relaxation is almost the fundamental thing that can happen rhythmically with syncopation, and then returning to the beat, and harmonically with dissonance and returning to consonance, motivically straying from the motive and returning to it, and so on. So it's a constant living, breathing And I think one has to sense that in each piece. And so all those things go into the studying, but also I think just a lot is happening unconsciously.
Right.
Where if you're living with the piece, you're just singing it to yourself and
Yeah.
imagining it to yourself, humming it to yourself, and
Yeah.
dreaming it when you're asleep and so on.
Very true.
And at the deepest level, that's probably the most important thing that's happening. I mean, it's getting absorbed, and you're just finding the most natural way, an organic way of thinking of every part of it and how it all fits together. So that in the end, you want both yourself and the audience to be completely unaware of all the detailed work that's gone into it. I mean, one is not showing things, one is not giving an analysis of the piece while one's playing it or anything like that. It's just a natural utterance, just like singing in the shower. And it just comes out in the most natural way. And that's what one is aiming for. But I think the naturalness comes from hard work.
Totally agree.
I mean, I think for some people, they just are able to rely completely on their instincts. And if they're extremely, extremely gifted, perhaps sometimes that's enough. Although I think usually it's not enough even for the very gifted, because there are always going to be some styles and some issues which are not so clear even to the most instinctive musician. And I think one has to be able to understand on all levels. But at the end, it has to come back to the instinct having been steeped in your study. And so it certainly must end up being instinctive, but your instincts have maybe been molded or changed
Yes, of
through the
course.
process of your studying.
That's so valuable, David. It really is, because I think now there's very little kind of, I don't know, people think that they can get away with very little knowledge of harmony or, backgrounds, these kind of things. But that is actually what makes the music, that's essentially, how your piece is developing, and you can,
Yes. I think one problem is that in a lot of music colleges and schools, the study of analysis and harmony and so on is so separated from playing. So you go to your teacher with your instrument and have an hour's lesson. And then you maybe go to your history lesson or your analysis lesson, sitting behind a desk with a pen and piece of paper. And they're completely unrelated. So, I mean, I find that I sometimes coach students who actually have far more theoretical knowledge than I do. Which is not difficult, and but they're not applying the simplest of things into their playing. So they play, they play a phrase which has an intense, I don't know, diminished harmony. It goes the way through, and then it resolves and relaxes onto the cadence, which they would know perfectly well in the schoolroom, as it were, by their desk. But by the way they're vibrating on the instrument and using the bow, they're not doing that simple and obvious relaxation. And somehow my feeling is that one should study harmony and analysis with the instrument in your hand. That it should be completely organically connected.
And integrated, yes.
Yeah, integrated, exactly.
Yes.
That's a good word, made whole. And so it shouldn't be seen as some sort of dry, academic, irrelevant process where one can fall asleep and skip and sort of text under the desk because it's only analysis. It is part and parcel of feeling the piece. And this expression about understanding music, in the case of music, is a feeling process. I mean, you can't understand music in some analytic, written way. If you don't feel what you're talking about, then you don't understand it. And I mean, audiences can sometimes understand music much better than players, in the sense that they really, if they're very musical, someone in the audience can really feel what's going on, even if they can't name it. And so on. And that's a much better form of understanding than being able to name it but not feeling it. And an artist, but it is not just a matter of naming. I mean, for instance, isn't perhaps not so important to be able to name each chord, but I think it is important to recognize that a certain key which is like the grit in the oyster, in a certain piece, keeps returning, but there might be 5 minutes or 10 minutes between each return. And because we tend not to have a memory for that key, having been through other keys, it's easy to miss that, but that might be a very important part of the story. And if the player understands it, then they can help to play it in such a way which makes it happen in a certain way in them, and then the audience might respond, even if unconsciously. There's a good example in the E minor 59-2 quartet, in which really the note C, the flattened six, comes in all the first three movements, sort of fortissimo and really strongly emphasized. I mean, there's no doubt that it's an important moment. And there's a big clash between C and B, the dominant B, and the C. There's a huge clash between them before it resolves onto E. And that happens in every single one of the three movements, and that is not an accident. And then it's not an accident in the fourth movement. The whole movement starts in C major, even though we're in E minor, but the whole melody is C major, and then it's yanked back to E minor, and that keeps happening. That's the sort of essence of the main theme in the last movement. Now, I mean, that sort of thing, it is really important to be aware of that sort of thing. I think otherwise you're missing what's going on in the piece and the way the movements relate to each other.
So David, I mean, let's talk a little bit more about, quartets, of course, because, you are part of a very famous quartet, Indelian Quartet, and you have, I mean, really, your concerts are just a joy. And I really, one of the few quartets where I feel it's just one sort of one creature that you really are so connected. And I'm wondering, so do you, I mean, I'm sure this question was asked a lot and it's a bit boring, but do you ever have a disagreement now in these years? Or, because, they're four human beings, they might think differently, or do you really have one sort of thought behind all four of you?
Not at all. We disagree all the time and very radically about so much. I mean, I think, actually, just to pick up on what you were saying about feeling that the quartet is one instrument. I mean, in many ways, I think whether you should sound like one instrument depends on the writing of what you're playing. And very often, actually, you should sound like very distinct voices, because the typical quartet texture is two or three voices. I mean, there'll be a main voice, but there'll also be a subsidiary voice, and the bass line is sort of a voice. So at least two or three voices. And the voices keep changing. So who has the main line keeps changing, who has the subsidiary voice keeps changing, even who has the bass line changes.
Yeah. I guess what I meant that, of course I understand about the voicing, but when you perform, I always feel that you are really behind that idea, especially as if you are one brain. Of course, that's what I think I understand. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's great if it sounds like that, but no, we do we do have a lot of disagreement about what we're doing. But I suppose, we over the years we've tried a lot of things. I mean, we try and try out anybody's suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important to do that, because so often, I mean, I coach young quartets, and so often I think they're arguing about words. I don't really know what it is they're differing about sometimes, except that they prefer one of them is fixated on one particular word for describing it, and someone else doesn't really like that word. I mean, that's not the only problem, but when they actually pick their instruments and play it, and they try someone's idea, the person whose idea is being tried often says, "Oh, well, I didn't really mean that. I mean that, but we've got to do this as well to make it work, and maybe I mean a bit less of that, and I don't mean, and it's modified a lot. You have to have about 5 goes at trying it until you're trying it to the satisfaction of the person making the suggestion. And then sometimes the person who's opposing the idea might say, oh yes, well, I like most of that, but I just think we need to add it. We mustn't lose sight of this as well. And we say, okay, let's add that, and you add that, and in a good rehearsal, everybody in the end says, yes, that's what I meant, and you've modified all the ideas a little bit, and you've by the trying and they modified trying. Of course, it doesn't always happen like that. I mean, sometimes you just simply do not find a way. And I think over the years, we learnt not to push and push and push to a resolution. I mean, to sleep on it and wait till the next time we rehearse. And maybe someone comes up with a third idea, which is neither of the two competing ideas. And there are always 100 ways of doing things, and one shouldn't get too fixated on the opposing ideas, because there are many more. And so, I mean, for instance, tempo is one of the hardest things to fix, because if someone just feels that it's way too slow or way too fast, and you try it in the slow way, and the other person says, no, that's too slow, and you go to the fast way, and the other person says, and if you just go backwards and forwards like a pendulum, that's not going to get you anywhere. Sure. So I think that the solution is to realize that the feeling of a tempo is so affected by so many other factors rather than the metronomic speed. Sure. And lots of things work well if everything is in place at different metronomic speeds. So it might be that what's troubling the person who thinks it's too fast is that it's a bit breathless. Yes. There's not enough space between phrases. It's too cluttered. The balance needs to be clarified more clearly. There needs to be room for a certain amount of rubato. So there's a basic tempo, but it needs rubato here and there. All these things. And if you introduce these elements, then it maybe stops feeling quite so too fast. And then if you go to the slow version, and the person who wants it faster thinks, well, it's just dragging, and it's, well, okay, so you take out too many beats within, you make it, even though it's slow, you make it in 2/4 rather than 4/4 or whatever, and you don't actually make writs at the ends of phrases, and you keep the shape of the phrase in mind despite the slow tempo, then that improves as well. And then at some point you can just play roughly in the middle, and you've sorted out all those other factors, and everything falls in place. And again, everyone says, that's the tempo I thought. And it might well not be the tempo actually that you thought, but you're happy with it. Fantastic. So, I mean, these are the processes of rehearsing which are benign and very satisfying. And when it goes wrong, it's when people get very dug into what they believe in. Sure. Or you just don't have the creativity that day to find all these surrounding features which make a big difference, and another day you will. And that's why it's very important not to get too embattled into your position, because that will make it less likely that the next day when new ideas come in that you'll be open to them.
David, it's really interesting, actually, really, for all, I guess, chamber ensembles, even like a duo is so important. But let's come back to, Beethoven's late quartets. I mean, one of the really best music ever written, but it's huge. It's marathon. I mean, I'm a pianist. I only kind of hear it. I don't play it. So, but I always find that I need kind of space. Even after one quartet to digest. So, how does it feel to perform it? And because it's usually done as a cycle. And do you agree that the kind of to play it as a cycle is the way to play it? Though that interests me a lot.
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think the vast majority of times we've performed Beethoven quartets has just been as one piece in a concert of other composers. We've played the cycle. I mean, in the vast majority of our quartet concerts, we've included a Beethoven piece of one sort or another. I would say, much more than 50% of the time. But we've done probably only about 15 or 16 cycles in our time. In fact, we have an interrupted one at the moment in Cambridge, which we never finished, unfortunately. It's very different playing them as a cycle. I mean, each piece is unique universe.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about all the different emotions and the different characters in Beethoven's works, within work and from one work to another. But there's also, completely different techniques, completely different sound world. I mean, I'm not sure if somehow you'd become an aficionado of classical music, but somehow you'd never heard a work of Beethoven. And if I played you an Opus 18 and then played you Opus 135, I mean, would you know it was the same composer? I'm not sure. I mean, if I did that with Bach or with Mozart, you would certainly know.
Yes.
There's no question you would know. But with Beethoven, I'm not sure. It's so different. And yet, when you are familiar with it, it feels that despite all the huge differences, every work is saturated with Beethoven. So in a way, I'm contradicting myself. But I think, once you know Beethoven, it's just purely him, whether it's Opus 18 or whether it's 132. But even within the lates, it's like each piece is a universe. I mean, he gets an idea which, for other composers, would be a complete compositional style for a lifetime, which for Beethoven he uses in one movement only, and never again. Completely extraordinary. And I think they're three or four of the lates are very related to each other motivically and in all sorts of ways, and yet there's such a different feel to them. Sorry, I've completely forgotten. What was your question?
No, you're exactly right. It's about,
playing as a cycle.
Yes, as a cycle. Yeah. And really, because it's like a marathon, really.
It is a bit of a feeling like that. But I think, the benefit of the cycle is it puts each of the works in the perspective of the other pieces. I mean, you feel how different they are, and you feel how Beethoven they all are.
Yes.
I mean, you get both those sort of feelings, and you marvel at how different they are, and yet they're coming from one incredible, expansive heart and brain. And the cycle is wonderful for showing that, and it is for the player an absolute mountain to climb.
Yeah.
But there is something absolutely exhilarating and thrilling when you get. We always ended with Opus 130 and the Grace Fugue.
Yeah.
And the fugue in itself is Opus 130 is a mountain to climb, and then when you get to the end of it, the fugue is an enormous mountain to climb. And there was always something absolutely thrilling about bringing a cycle to an end, this sort of huge journey which you've gone through with your audience, and bring it to an end with such an extraordinary, engrossing piece as the Grace Fugue.
Well, it's really fascinating, and of course, I mean, as I said, I'm keep coming back to this idea that you do it as one brain, but you're four people there. So that's I really find that extraordinary as a pianist.
Yes.
That it's and I know how difficult it is to get to that stage, and how much work goes into it. But so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I always was under impression that in Beethoven times there wasn't really something like a fixed quartet. I'm not sure if I'm right, but I couldn't find somewhere that people were fixed. So do you think it kind of affected the way they played it at the time?
It must have done. I mean, you're absolutely right. There weren't really any professional quartets in the sense of people spending the majority of their time making their living playing in a string quartet, really until after the First World War. Mm-hmm. There were some quartets, but I think the players were only very occasionally spending their time playing them. So in Beethoven's time, there was a quartet called the Supremacy Quartet, mm-hmm. and they played to Beethoven, and Beethoven knew them each individually as well, and they would get together and play a new Beethoven quartet to him. and he would coach them on it, and they would maybe play it in a performance or two, but they certainly weren't traveling around Europe being the Supremacy Quartet. They were doing mostly doing other things, and of course the famous Joachim Quartet, which had, in a way, relatively fixed members when they were in Berlin or nearby. But when Joachim came to England to play a quartet tour, he didn't bring the members of the Joachim Quartet with him. He played with 3 British players. I think the idea for quartets was that they were for the players. They were played for the pleasure of playing together, rather than performed. They weren't exactly seen as concert vehicles in the way that symphonies were, and I have very little idea how much people practiced and rehearsed them. I mean, you could not play a Razumovsky quartet without rehearsing it, that's for sure. and I mean, helpful to have Beethoven coaching you on it, no doubt. Although he was pretty deaf by the time he was writing, especially the late quartet.
Sure.
But yes, it must have been very different. But on the other hand, it must have been thrilling. I mean, and there was a wonderful story of a quartet playing Mozart's first 6 quartets dedicated to Haydn, and Mozart was playing, and Haydn was playing, and Dietersdorf was playing, and 2 or 3 people listening, like Mozart's father. And that was the first time that the Mozart which were dedicated to Haydn, were played, and these evenings must have been incredible. But very different from hearing a professional quartet play them for the 300th time in the Wigmore, for instance. There's no doubt that Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven took quartet writing extremely seriously. I mean, just the fact that Beethoven devoted his last years to writing almost nothing but quartets. And just from the nature of the works, I mean, one only has to listen to them to know that they were taken vastly seriously. So maybe it was probably an advantage in many ways that they weren't meant for large audiences.
Yes.
Because Beethoven, I mean, the last quartets, I mean, he's deaf and he's isolated and he's ill, and he was just writing them because he needed to write them. So there are no restraints, there's no constraints of what is technically possible, what will be understandable to the audience, what, all these things have gone. It's just completely him expressing himself. And when people complained they couldn't understand them, he said, well, they're written for a later age, but actually they're written for himself. And I suppose he knew if they were as coherent and as wonderful as I'm sure he knew they were, that people would one day appreciate them. But it really wasn't his business. He wasn't going to know about that. They just had to be written because they were there in his heart. And I guess that's how it was. It's interesting. You said a bit earlier about, and it just comes back to me, about from the point of view of a pianist, imagining studying and playing these quartets with 4 different brains as opposed to 1 different brain. It's quite an interesting comparison because so often in the writing there are 3 or 4 different voices, and more towards the late period, which becomes more and more contrapuntal in texture. I would say the quartet, I mean, from a pianist point of view, playing a late Beethoven piano sonata, you have to be able to divide yourself into 3 or 4 independent entities.
Yes.
So, I mean, not only are you playing all these different lines, but the phrasing and shaping and even the character of a bass line might be completely different. And different, again, from the soprano voice. So that you somehow, I don't know how you do it, you have to 3 or 4 people phrasing to different places and playing with different characters and different voices. Well, for the string quartet, that's easy
Yes.
because we are four different people, and we can engross ourselves in the one line that we're playing. But what's difficult for us and easier for you is to have unified overall conception,
Yes.
which
Yes.
you can have your arguments within yourself, but basically easier to resolve those, and you are one organizing musical brain playing, whereas the quartet has to work at that. So we have piano and string quartet. We have exactly opposite
That's exactly.
advantages and disadvantages in playing what is quite similar music. I mean, Beethoven himself arranged one of the piano sonatas, Opus 14, number 1, a wonderful arrangement for string quartet, in which he really thought about and said, and he said, no one else could have done this. He even changed the key, and he composed a lot very differently, and it's a fascinating study to compare the two.
Yeah. Yeah.
But really, I hear all the piano sonatas could be arranged theoretically for string quartet. I mean, they have the same sort of voices and voice leading and so on, and similarly, you could be playing the quartets on the piano theoretically, although you couldn't probably manage all the notes, and it's very similar music.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I would love to have sort of chamber partners to help.
Yes, yes, yes.
Would be terrific. So, David, really, one of the last kind of few questions. Has your perception of Beethoven's music changed over the years?
Actually, I don't think it's radically changed, but I think it's deepened. I mean, I think my emotional response is stronger and stronger to the music the older I get, and the more I hear the pieces. I suppose the perception has been broadened by knowing more and more Beethoven. I mean, I suppose when I started playing them, I didn't know all the piano sonatas. I didn't know the Missa Solemnis. I didn't know. I mean, it's important to know everything that he wrote, or as much as you can that he wrote, because everything sheds light on everything else, either by contrast or similarity or whatever. And I just think I love it more and more. I mean, it's just that's the main change. I think my fundamental idea of what it's about hasn't hugely changed. There might be specific movements, which I have a pretty different idea of, but broadly speaking, probably not.
Interesting, very, very interesting. And a last question for you, and I know it will be very hard, but and it also sounds simple, but I don't want to kind of to sound simple. But what is really Beethoven's music for you? I mean, what are the kind of immediate adjectives that come into your head when someone says Beethoven? There can be multiple. It's just really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, where do we start? Profound humanity, warmth, so in its total integrity, moral seriousness. And as soon as I say seriousness, I want to say a huge amount of humor, fun, playfulness, naughtiness, energy, serenity. It's the whole gamut. I mean, you can't limit it in any way. It's really, everything is in Beethoven. But I suppose that nothing is pale. I mean, it's committed. Every character is so. I mean, it might be ambiguous. There might be 2 or 3 characters going at the same time. There might be like characters on the stage in an opera. I mean, as in Fidelia, but the sense of utter commitment, and nothing pale, strong characters, even if they're very gentle characters. I mean, they can be incredibly gentle characters and very loving, but there's a strength of feeling which is unmistakable, and yet he's never sentimental. it's never self-pitying. There's a however hugely emotional it is, there's ultimately a balance and a structure and a healthiness about it all, which is why he just about stays within the bounds of
Yeah.
what one would call
Yeah.
classical sensibility.
Oh, David, well, that was really wonderful. And thank you so much for describing kind of the range that at least close to you, because I'm sure many feel the same, but it's so interesting to find out. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Well,
Thank you very much for being my guest. Really, sheer delight. Thank you. Thank you.
it's been a big pleasure for me as well. Lovely
Thank
to
you.
see you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.